Hi, and thanks for joining me. I'd like to spend a bit of time considering how we're moving through the post-pandemic world. And there hasn't been a cut-off point, has there? We seem to have dovetailed into an in-between, a sort of limbo between the pandemic world and what we would like the post-pandemic world to be. But that's not what's going on. We're in an interim space, and it's causing some confusion. So we've been doing some thinking about what's the cause of this? What are the contributory factors that I think are adding to a general sense of lack of direction, lack of purpose, and unhappiness, and on the other side are providing opportunities to really reassess what it is we've been doing and to see if we can maybe do things better. So I've thought of it in terms of rituals, sub-rituals, and micro-rituals. And when we think of ritualized behavior, sometimes we might think of it in terms of celebrations, ceremonies, specific times and places in the year. And absolutely, that's a completely valid way of looking at it. My view is that there are other rituals that sustain us on a daily, hourly basis. And some of them are micro rituals or sub rituals. And that's what I'd like us to be thinking about as we go through this small presentation. Now, it starts off with an overview of what happens when we get these rituals wrong. I do hope you enjoy what we've got here for you and look forward to talking to you about it. Thank you. The story starts with the four of us, with Paul Jeffrey, John Lee, Steve Harding and myself. About this time, 2020, so October, November 2020, came together in a loose association and began an exchange of ideas, and part of which included where do we now have conversations that help us maybe to identify some of the issues that we're going to face as we move forward and hopefully out of COVID, and looking at maybe some of the structural changes that are needed or required, and also changes of attitudes, beliefs and behaviours. So it was very much an exchange of views between four people who thought, well, is this something that we should share here? And I then began to become interested in the power of ritual. You know, for some of us of an age, the answer to the rhetorical question is, how could I forget him? However, moving quickly on, the idea of taking a discipline and declaring it a waste of money because it doesn't much chime with your own beliefs, I think is always a bit of a risky thing to say. Specifically, some of the ideas, some of the methodology, and some of the knowledge created and wisdom shared through anthropology might have been very useful to us, and I'm going to try and demonstrate why. Do you know, it's already been pointed out to me that the previous slide starts with "Remember Norman Tebbit," and this one starts with "However." Let's just leave it there, shall we? The Ebola crisis in largely Central Africa provided us with a high-speed dress rehearsal from which we might have learned. So let's take a look at some of the work that was carried out there that saw the integration of big data, medical intervention, the support of the military, and massively energised scientific community. And so here we go. Some big players involved, and their intended response was to make things better. What actually happened in some cases was quite the reverse. And you can see from this that there's a complete contrast in the way people engage and interact with ill people. That the Western model is about isolation. How the regional model, however, was more to do about engage with, be present alongside. And this caused its own challenges. Throughout history, plagues, and the inverted commas are intentional there, have been the precursor of blaming other people for them. It couldn't be us. And this has then led to an overestimation of the contribution or the bringing of the plague from outside, whilst at the same time ignoring how the inside group actually contributes to the circulation. And There's something quite subtle going on there in terms of our own ritualised behaviour. It's easier to blame others than it is to give up on our own rituals, even if they at their very best lead to complacency and at their worst are actually quite dangerous. I don't underestimate the cultural shock of the pandemic in the UK, which is where we're talking about right now. But if we take a look at what we knew from Ebola, that for patients and their families, seeing caring professionals dressed in this manner was quite dislocating for them. It's not hard then to import that into our own cultural context, where caregivers were giving care from behind a barrier and the recipients of their care saw only a small section of their faces. So we had all of these things in place, and yet somehow there was a great discomfort about why it didn't work. And my view is that it really bumped up against some of our expectations of what care looks like, what care sounds like, and how it's given. It seems very important that as we learn, we check out that we're learning the right things. And I'm just going to concern myself for a little while on what happened with malaria outbreaks and how they were tracked in Kenya using mobile phones. It was actually very, very successful in that scientists and ground workers, field workers were able to get a really good fix on how the spread was taking place, where it was its most intense areas that were going into epidemics, and so on. So the mobile phone tracking data worked really well in this context. Could it be switched to another one? Well, yeah, it could, but there were things that needed to be considered, and they weren't. And here's what happened. Well, when we look at what didn't work out as well as it might have, the first one was an assumption that English was a major language of communication in Central Western Africa. It's not, it's French, followed by increased use of local dialects. The way in which information was distributed, the communication towers, there were fewer towers, and there was a misassumption made around phone usage. And phone usage suggested that 94% of the population had actually got a mobile phone. They hadn't. What you had got was high intensity use, high frequency use of one mobile phone within a family or a small group or a village community. So that kind of skewed the data. But the important thing for us is that we recognise that simply that's how things were done in those communities. What I'm suggesting here is that it's easy to get things wrong based on two assumptions. Assumption one, we know what's right and we know what's best by the providers and givers. And assumption two, we know what's best for us and we want to do what we've always done by the recipients of care in a volatile, dangerous, and very often quick-moving situation. The failure to understand what mattered on both sides and create a space in which that dialogue could take place or should have taken place is perhaps understandable when we think of just how quickly we needed to respond to prevent death rates accelerating beyond what it is we've seen. So it's a matter of saying, well, we get it. But my view here is that what was being required of us was playing into sidelining rituals that have sustained us as a community, as a society, for going back throughout our own lifetimes and back into lifetimes of our parents, grandparents, and so on. They were important, they are important, and are embedded. The conversations we're having now seem to be about how we carry on, or how we restore, or how we replace rituals, sub-rituals, micro-rituals that have taken place in our working environment, our social environment, and semi-social environment. And by that, I'm thinking of that kind of interface between the workplace and social engagements within the workplace, or simple stuff like going out for a coffee with each other. There are also spiritual aspects of this, literally spiritual aspects of this, about how people relate to their view of a greater power, a power beyond, and that there's an interaction here of very powerful forces that, as suggested previously, have glued us together, have held a place for us, that now are under considerable threat. And we continue to ask ourselves, what do we do about this? How do we continue to move forward in a place of great uncertainty, where some of the echoes from our recent past are not encouraging? Okay, so I'm asking you just to stay with me for a little bit on this. We've moved from a situation where a couple of years ago, things were pretty certain. We had organised working times, organised social contact times, organised free time where we did very little at all. And then within that was structured a whole lot of social events, cultural events that actually contributed to the way we ran and organised our lives. And that bubble has been burst. So what happens here when we are seeking to try and find some sort of sense of, I'm going to use the word normality, but what I mean by that is when we find some way of resetting, reconfiguring ourselves. Right, this isn't a quiz, so you don't need to know them all. So I'll give them you anyway. We have The Lion King, Harry Potter, Batman, Star Wars, Cinderella, The Lord of the Rings, and Jungle Book. So, classics. And they use the same sort of format, don't they? And then you can just see it out there on the right section of the clip. The format used is the hero's journey, and it's been a very useful narrative in team development and organisational development. If we apply the hero's journey to our current situation, that we are in the unknown, I wonder what your view is about which part of the unknown we're actually in, and how useful it would be if we could acknowledge at a social level that that is actually where we are. We are in the unknown, and we are trying to reconfigure our compass, our reference points, in order to help us move through this into a known and safer place. Okay, so we're now on our last slide, and here's my suggestion that we are in a zone of uncertainty where our pre-existing rituals have been severely shaken. We have got an opportunity, and I think it's a necessity, to take a look at some of those pre-existing rituals, and to ask ourselves, well, which of those are useful and we would want them to return? Which have outlived their usefulness, and we're clinging onto them in a not good way. They're actually in the way of us taking the forward steps and making the progress that we need to. And are there new ones? Are there ones that need to be adjusted, developed, and replaced? And what are we replacing pre-existing rituals with? What new behaviours are we looking for? And I also think it's really important that we think about how we almost mourn the loss of that which has passed, because they have been an important part of our lives. They have been shaken, and our world of ritual has been turned upside down, and we are, in so many ways, struggling to replace that sense of stability, that sense of purpose, that sense of this is how we progress through our lives, socially, professionally, and in those other areas mentioned. So that's our spirituality, our connectivity, and the way we engage with each other on a formal and informal basis. So I hope we've got something we can talk about here. Thank you.